Welcome to part 2 of my 3-part response to J. Warner Wallace's article titled The Problem with Answering the Problem of Evil. In that article, Wallace lays out several theodicies, i.e., supposed refutations of the problem of evil proof of God's non-existence, claiming that even if individually none of them is persuasive, they are cumulatively persuasive. If you are not familiar with the problem of evil proof, or if you just plain have not seen part 1 yet, you can find a link to part 1 in this video's YouTube video description area. Anyways, I'm reviewing the theodicies that Wallace puts forth to see if they hold any water. Since Wallace states that these theodicies are meant to be persuasive cumulatively rather than individually, I will examine them not only for their individual persuasiveness, but whether they even make a dent in the balance that would make them suitable for cumulative evidence. I finished off part 1 by refuting the free will excuse, which is the first theodicy listed in the article. I will move on to the next theodicy in just a moment. The second theodicy in Wallace's article he titles, The Relationship Between Human Suffering and the Nature of God. My immediate reaction to seeing that title was, what the frell? After all, if the nature of God requires God to allow, let alone cause human suffering, that does not sound like a God who has all lovingness as part of its nature. So I have to read on to figure out what the frell this guy is getting at. Here are the 3 characteristics of God that supposedly, according to this guy, explain how an all-loving God could allow such suffering. Number 1, a good God values character over comfort. Creature comforts are temporary, but character transcends time. Number 2, a transcendent God understands that love is the perfect balance between mercy and justice. And number 3, an eternal God provides humans with an existence beyond the grave. The first characteristic I will hold off on addressing until after I have addressed the other 2. Now, any argument based on the second characteristic of this list is in many ways just like the free will excuse in that it ignores the fact that according to the monotheistic model of the universe, our minds and behavior are designed by none other than God himself. So the ultimate origin of any evil that God's fist of so-called justice would have to come down on is none other than, once again, God. Based on that, I can say that any argument appealing to this characteristic is completely worthless, not even suitable to use as part of cumulative evidence. As for the third characteristic, the bit about God providing for our existence beyond the grave, and the problem of evil is not concerned with the bit about how there's no actual proof of this being real, but is on something else. That one seems to be a mere subset of another classical theodicy offered by theists that I call the grater-good excuse. As this is the first point in the article that a subset of the grater-good excuse comes up, I will debunk it now. Basically, the grater-good excuse claims that God has to allow certain evils in order to provide for a greater good that is part of his master plan. But why does this not make sense from a tri-omni God? Very simple. If there is really no way that God could have found a more humane means by which to achieve that greater good, then that means that this God is not really all-powerful, as clearly there is something within the realm of logical coherence that this God cannot do. If there is a way, but this God does not know it, then that proves that this God is not truly all-knowing. And if there is a way that God could have achieved this greater good more humanely, and God knows about it, but still chose anyway to utilize the crueler means to this end, then that is not the act of a truly all-loving God. Therefore, allowing suffering, even for the sake of a greater good, proves that at least one of the three aspects of a tri-omni God is missing. So, now that the second characteristic has been debunked as an excuse on the basis of it overlooking God's logical role in the origin of evil, and the third characteristic has been debunked as an instance of the greater good excuse, let us rewind to the first characteristic. A good God values character over comfort. Creature comforts are temporary, but character transcends time. This characteristic, just like the third one, is an example of the greater good excuse, and as such has been debunked when I debunked the greater good excuse. But in addition, just like the second characteristic, it too lets God off the hook for having created us with flawed character to begin with. And since it seems that argument based on this characteristic, God's emphasis of character over comfort, will come up again in this article, I should probably give it the label, the character building excuse. So again, our argument based on this characteristic is worthless. It cannot even count toward cumulative proof. It is total bunk. So, having examined arguments based on these characteristics, I think that I can safely say that theodicy based on the relation between suffering and God's nature is not just singularly unpersuasive, but altogether worthless, not suitable even for use in cumulative evidence. So let us move on to the next theodicy titled in the article, The Relationship Between Natural Evil and God's Existence. So that my presentation will not take forever, this one I will just paraphrase. It gives 4 reasons why God would allow what the author calls natural evils to exist. Things such as earthquakes, tsunami, even deadly pandemics. The first is that consequences are necessary for free will to have any meaning. However, as I established in part 1, the free will excuse is worthless because in a monotheistic universe, nobody would sin unless God created them in such a way as to be prone to sin. I will put in the video description area of this video a link to where in part 1 I explain this in more detail. But anyways, since the free will excuse itself is utterly worthless, so is any excuse that builds upon it. The second reason for God tolerating so-called natural evil is that it is a necessary consequence of human agency. I'm not sure how this differs from being a necessary consequence of free will. I do not think that there is a substantial difference. Frankly, Wallace's claim that the theodicies work cumulatively rather than individually is starting to look like it is an occasion for another installment of Malconduct Exposed. And it seems like Wallace here is committing not just one malconduct, but 2 malconducts. The first malconduct that he commits is the Gish Gallop. Wikipedia defines the Gish Gallop as a rhetorical technique in which a debater attempts to overwhelm an opponent by excessive number of arguments without regard for the accuracy or strength of those arguments. And I should add, Wallace so far seems to be kicking the Gish Gallop an extra notch by actually giving very few arguments, but presenting each one over and over as different arguments. This tactic of deceitfully inflating his number of arguments is what I am counting as his second malconduct. The Gish Gallop is often an effective malconduct because of something known as Brandolini's Law, which states that the amount of energy required to debunk utter nonsense is generally significantly greater than the amount needed to put forth that same utter nonsense. Are Wallace's arguments going to continue being as worthless and frankly downright repetitious as they have thus far been? Well, I may have my guess about the answer to that, but just from reading this far into the article, it seems too soon to actually say so. However, even if every argument Wallace offers from this point on really does make progress toward cumulative evidence, Wallace should have opened with such sensible arguments and should be ashamed of having even gone this far, offering nothing but utter nonsense. As a matter of fact, even if the next argument he gives is on its own completely persuasive, something that he does not even claim to be the case, then he should have started with that argument, and certainly has no excuse for wasting our time with so much baloney before getting to it. Anyways, back to the theodicy. The third reason Wallace gives for God allowing so-called natural evil is that it challenges us to think about God for the first time. And the fourth reason, it can provide us with opportunity to develop godly character. So it looks like Wallace is continuing his Gish Gallop with two more repetitions of the character-building excuse. This brings us to the end of Wallace's nonsense about the relationship between natural evil and God's existence. In part 3, I will pick up with the next theodicy he gives us. Hopefully, having called out his Gish Gallop will enable me to move through the rest of his article a bit faster. Anyway, I hope that you are enjoying this presentation. Please like, subscribe, comment, ring the bell, check out part 3, which you can find a link to in the YouTube video description area of this installment. And until next time, see ya!